Today is April 17th, 2024. This is episode 72 of the Sports Daily College Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I'm joined by Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will go over Mark Pope's hire at Kentucky and then a couple of the big transfers that are going around in what is proven already to be a pretty chaotic transfer portal. So, Joe, let's get into it. We said Mark Pope was a outside candidate who they might end up getting, and that's who Kentucky ends up settling on. It is a Kentucky guy. He won a national championship there. BBN at first was a little bit underwhelmed, but they seem to be coming around after a pretty solid press conference. But overall thoughts on Mark Pope trading BYU for Kentucky?
Yeah, a few thoughts, Sean. I think their expectations going in were sky high, so I think them getting Pope initially would have been a disappointment, but I do think overall they welcome the idea. I think they really welcome. He is one of the best offensive coaches in the country, and they really need a change from Calipari's one and done model, right? I think from 2009 for the beginning of his tenure to 2018, you could say he's probably one of the more successful coaches in the country. He went to 11, 12, 14, 15. He went to 4 Final Fours, Sean. That can't be dismissed in like a 9-year run, and then they had a few Elite Eights in there too, plenty of SEC titles. That cannot be dismissed, but the last 6 years for Big Blue Nation have been very underwhelming. So I think they welcome this model of more stability. Sure, they're gonna have to get a lot of guys in the portal now. They have a few visitors on campus this weekend, but I do think they welcome the change, especially since it was implemented. And a lot of people are going to scream how this is similar to a Jawan, Ewing, Mullen, and even Penny Hardaway hire. I really strongly disagree. I do think, when you put him in comparison to names of Billy Donovan, Scott Drew, Jay Wright, like besides Scott Drew, the other two of those names were unrealistic. And truly, Sean, he is a very solid coach, but it is Kentucky. The expectations are sky high. I do think he is going to have a little patience there, maybe a year or two. But after that, we saw what happened to Billy Gillispie earlier in our lifetimes. They could turn on you very quickly if you don't get immediate results. So I think it's a good hire. I do think, I get that he only made the tournament once and blah, blah. But BYU did make it in a very tough Big 12 this year. They did win at Kansas.
The
So
only team
the
to win at
momentum,
Kansas.
yeah, the momentum's there, Sean. Maybe the pedigree and track record isn't traditionally what you would have at Kentucky, but he understands the culture. He has a lot of coaching experience, which is what Petty, Jawan, Ewing, a little Ewing, and Mullen didn't have, especially college experience. So to compare it to those would be silly, and frankly, that's just set out of hatred toward Kentucky for a lot of people. So overall, I give it a B- higher, Sean. I think it could definitely work out. It is Kentucky. It is a blue blood. Everything is there to win, so it's on Mark Pope now to do that.
Yeah, Joe, Pope has kind of been under the radar for his entire career as a coach. Now, Utah Valley did fairly well there, won a lot of basketball games, never won a regular season title, never won a conference title. Takes the step to BYU. Even in the West Coast Conference, Joe, they're still not the top dogs there. Definitely behind St. Mary's and Gonzaga. And, just last year, or 2 years ago now, if you're looking at it, they were awful in the WCC. And now this year was, again, Big 12, totally under the radar. Mike and I picked them to be 13th. And they have a great year. They get a 6th seed, but they got smoked by Duquesne in the first round. So as a coach, Pope is not really used to the bright lights, and there are no lights brighter than BBN and Kentucky at Rupp Arena. So I think that could be a little bit of a shock. He is not recruited very highly. Obviously, at BYU, there's the whole religious aspect, which is pretty unique. Only a single 4-star recruit in all of his time there, and never actually played with him. He was on a mission or something, and he's actually bringing him to Kentucky. So he's probably going to have a couple of BYU players, and then he's going to have to see who else he can fill out with this roster. But, Joe, he is a good coach in game. which I don't think anybody can really dispute. His teams have been excellent analytically, especially this year. They were very high in Ken Palm. That I think will help them, especially because Calipari's teams really up until this year were not great offensively. There's a couple outliers in there like the Davis year and a couple others, but this year BYU was ranked higher than Kentucky for most of the year, so that's another way to look at it. But Joe, is there such thing as realistic expectations for Mark Pope in year one?
They might say that beginning of the year, but by mid-December into January, it's going to be certainly make the tournament. I don't think that's unrealistic at Kentucky, but it could get even crazier. And I do think this is a fan base that is starved for a second weekend. They haven't been to one since
2019, I think.
19, yeah. It'll be 6 years now going into 2025 in Kentucky. That's too long. And I don't care who the coach is. That's an impatient fan base that's going to want to get to the second weekend. And, they've been starving for that for a while, Sean, and their appetite's not going to get any better as time goes by. I promise you that.
And the thing about that time period, Joe, that you said is they've had one team that was bad during that time. They've had teams good enough to make it. And Pope, I think the expectations are to make the tournament in year one. The SEC has enough teams at the bottom where even if they don't have a great season, they still should finish 7th, 8th in the SEC, and then you go from there. But he doesn't really have a roster yet, so I don't think we can say, like, oh, this season's a failure if they don't get to here when we know, like, 3 players that are linked with them. And, most of the recruits are gone. A couple of them have stayed, but it's going to be a completely different style of basketball for Kentucky next year. And, Mark Pope might not even know exactly what that is yet because he's still got to fill out his roster. Now, before we go into 2 other teams, Joe, I do want to ask you a question. 3 teams in this sort of triangle that's been paired together. Kentucky, Louisville, Arkansas. With what we know now, who has the best season next year?
Yeah, and if you want to expand that to a pentagon, you can even throw SMU, USC, and I guess SMU, UNC, in
and
there.
BYU.
USC. And BYU, yeah. So you really want to make that a hard question. But of those 3, Sean, Louisville, Arkansas,
I think
Kentucky.
I think there's one right now without knowing the roster that's probably going to be the best.
Yeah, are you going to say Arkansas?
Yep.
Yep. I'm going to go with the Hogs. I think Calipari, yes, the roster's not there as of, April 17th as we're recording
I think he's got Big Z, and that's about it right now.
Yeah. But I'll tell you, by April 27th, I think that roster looks a lot different. And, pretty much just imagine Kentucky's team for next year about 2 weeks ago before Cal took the job. Just imagine them in red and playing in Fayetteville, Arkansas. That's what it's going to be. So give me the Hogs of those 3 teams. I just think the rebuild at Louisville is too drastic. I do think I do think Kentucky is in a way better position to, I guess, start a tenure than you would be at Louisville. But Sean, it's got to be Arkansas. I don't think there's much of an argument there as of right now.
Yeah, I think so at this point. Now, there's very likely that all 3 of these teams could make the tournament. All 3 coaches are pretty good. Kelsey and Pope and Calipari, all, I would say, good coaches. And then, the infrastructure is there at all 3 of those schools, from what we know, to be able to get some of the very best talent in the country. So we'll have to see. But I think it's Arkansas at this point just because of, Calipari's ability to accumulate talent. But that'll be a good question that as some of these transfers start to go, Joe, that we can look back and every week and be like, well, Arkansas is looking pretty good this week, but Kentucky got these 3 guys. Now they might be up top. But Kentucky and Arkansas will be playing each other next year, and Kentucky and Louisville will be playing next year. So Pope is going to get both of those. I guess you have to call Arkansas-Kentucky a rivalry now with Calipari on the other
100%.
sideline. But Pope's going to get both those teams, and reportedly he's not backing out of the Indiana agreement, so he's going to host another rival in Mike Woodson and the Hoosiers.
Good for him. Yeah, good
Good
for
for
him.
before one of those games will be conference, but Pope is not going to be able to 12-0 his way through a week non-conference schedule in year one. Um, we're going to talk about two teams here, Joe. Shorter episode today because we're actually going to start some of our season recaps today. You'll see those later on, but two teams I want to highlight that have been very active in the portal. First one that we're going to go to is Rodney Terry and the Texas Longhorns. Now, they did lose Tyrese Hunter and Dylan Mitchell in the transfer portal, but they do bring in three pretty highly sought-after players. First off, Tremont Mark, the former Houston guard and former Arkansas guard last year under Eric Musselman. And then two of the Indiana State players, Julian Larry and Jason Kent. Gotta like what you've seen so far from Texas getting three pretty highly ranked transfers in the portal.
I think Tremont Mark highlights the three, Sean. I think, getting a guy like that, scoring volume average 16 points a game or something at Arkansas this year, I think that's the biggest necessity Texas is going to need. I'm really shocked at the Indiana State transfers. I know that picked up steam over the previous days before they committed, but you would have really thought they would have followed shirts to St. Louis or shopped around somewhere else in the Midwest. But really good on Rodney Terry. I do not think people are shocked he went into the portal. I think they would be more surprised at the final two they got from Indiana State. But the Tremont Mark one, I think, was less shocking to most people. Sean, what say you?
Terry, this is his second off season, and Asmus, he got in the portal last year. He was a pretty solid player, but other than that, all the portal players were brought in by Beard. Hunter was at Iowa State first, and Mitchell was somewhere else, and Dessou was somewhere else. So Texas is kind of, gone with the portal for a while here, and now there's really no choice. They're losing talent, and at least Mark is from at least near there, so he's coming back home. And those Indiana State players, while they might not be the two headliners in the portal from Terre Haute, and that'd be Robbie Avila and Isaiah Swope. These two players are starters, Power 5 quality starters, in my opinion. And we'll see what Texas can do as, they're going to the SEC this year one for them in a new conference. But I think we needed to highlight them because a lot of teams have a lot of scholarships open, and they at least are filling those with some pretty highly ranked transfers. Now, Joe, the next topic is going to be my Indiana Hoosiers. Hot seat, Mike Woodson at the end of the year. Fans, media people, other teams' fans were all pretty surprised that Indiana retained Woodson, especially so early on. Really, like February, they called it, that he was coming back. And, they go on that run at the end of the year, 5 wins in a row. He's been cooking in the portal. Miles Rice, the Pac-12 Freshman of the Year, and Umar Ballo, who's ranked number 1 on On3 Sports transfer rankings, have already committed to Woodson and the Hoosiers. Renew, Mbako, Galloway all come back. And then there are two other players, Connor Sejan and Kanan Carlisle, who are extremely close to committing. Has there been a team that has improved as much as Indiana in the transfer portal?
Nationwide, maybe you could have an argument, but I think, that'd be foolish to do at this time. In terms of the Big Ten, zero question whatsoever. I think USC has more of a potential to expand just based on the Musselman hire. Same with Michigan, but Michigan's rebuilding a roster. Indiana, I feel, with Banks, Gunn transferring out of there, who was the last one?
Sparks.
Yeah, with those three transferring out, sure, you could say they're replacing, especially having to replace Ware, but I think they've just supplemented the roster and updated it too. So it's more of a I think even with the without those two guys, Indiana would be somewhat competitive. But with these two guys, they got to be a contender for the conference, right, Sean?
What we know now, you have to say so because there isn't a team that's retaining as much production as IU is in the Big Ten. Purdue is retaining a lot of players, but not a lot of their production. Gazidi was most of that. And you have three pretty solid players coming back for Indiana. And you are replacing Ware with Ballo. Ware's a great player, obviously very different, but you're replacing a first-round NBA draft pick with the best center available, and then you get a point guard who was Pac-12 Freshman of the Year on Washington State and ran the whole show for them there. So, you have to like what you're seeing so far. Obviously, I do. Galloway might not even start. He might be coming off the bench, which is what the role that he was last year when Hood Schifino and Trace were there, and that was a great role for him. So we could see him improve, and then they've still got a couple scholarships left. They're recruiting some NAIA guys. Carlisle and Nasijan are real close. They haven't quite committed yet, but all signs are pointing to them being Hoosiers. And then you got a couple other players who are interested and a couple bigger names who are in the transfer portal that we'll go to in a little bit, Joe. But I think right now this team's pretty good, and they've still got 3 scholarships left that Woodson has every intention of filling. So you have to say that the 2 bigs, you get Ballo to start him at the 5, Renew's there at the 4. There is a little bit of a concern around that, but you have to like the accumulation of talent that Mike Woodson has done here, because last year the play style wasn't great, but they were seriously lacking in the talent department.
Yeah, Sean, and I want to say now at this point with the 3 open slots they currently have, it's not even for necessity. I think it's just for depth, and I think the talent is already there. Now getting depth, that's a luxury a lot of teams, especially in this new age of college basketball, aren't going to have, and that's a distinct advantage Indiana should really placate toward right now.
Yeah, there was that 5-game winning streak that we were talking about, Joe. They basically went 2 off the bench. And Cups was a contributor, one of those 7. And Leo was a contributor, one of those 7. And they probably wouldn't have been on a lot of Big Ten teams last year. But Woodson's going to have every chance to have this team right near the top of the Big Ten with Zach Edey out of the conference, with Terrence Shannon out of the conference. I think the Big Ten is there for the taking this year, and we'll have to see where it goes. Obviously, a lot of time still left in the transfer portal. Your team, Michigan, you've got 11, 10 scholarships left to fill.
Yeah, 10.
GW3 and Cheddar are back, right? And
Amari.
So not 9 or 10, but your team's going to look all different. We've got a ton of other spots still available throughout the conference, but had to talk about the Hoosiers because they are winning the offseason at this point. So, Joe, we've got a couple of later entrants to the transfer portal, and a couple of them were very shocking. We'll start with the St. Mary's guard, sophomore Aiden Mahinmi. Excellent last year as a freshman. The same again this year as a sophomore. He's going to have some of every team with a roster spot would like to have Mahinmi on their team. He's a pretty good player.
Yeah, Sean, I think Mahinmi's a really good player. He averaged 13 points both his freshman and sophomore year at St. Mary's. Very good ball handler. It really could play between the 1 and the 2. I think that's the biggest part of this, Sean. Everything I'm hearing, we're in a distinct amount of college basketball chats from people across the country. I'm more tied in the Michigan scene, which is why this is very relevant. Justin Joyner, St. Mary's top assistant, his primary recruiter, someone he's worked with since the 5th grade, was hired by Dusty May a week ago. Michigan is going to be a team to watch here. I don't know if they're the team to beat. Early passes that San Diego State is the team to beat. Keep in mind, Mahinmi entered the portal about 24 hours ago since the recording of this podcast. So I think right now, Sean, it's San Diego State and Michigan are the teams to watch. And then between those two, I think San Diego State is the most likely. But a name like Mahinmi and a player like Mahinmi, it's hard to believe he's not going to be fending off offers for the next 2-3 days.
Yeah, I think he'll, every time they post, this transfer tells me he's heard from these schools. It'll be Kentucky, Arkansas, St. John's, and all the big-time coaches looking for transfers. But looks like it's a 2-horse race at this point for Mahinmi. I'm a little bit surprised that he's doing this. He had every opportunity to be a one-and-done last year, and he decided to go back to St. Mary's, you'd think maybe, okay, if you transfer out of there, you understand that. But he still has 2 years left of eligibility, which, a lot of these transfers have one. So that's an added bonus. If he does well enough, he's probably going to the league. But he is an exceptional player. There was another big name that came yesterday, and this was somewhat not surprising because Duke, when Tyrese Proctor announced that he was returning, they promoted Caleb Foster and Tyrese Proctor as their backcourt for next year. And they had them on the Brotherhood pod, and this is our backcourt next year. And let alone, there's Jeremy Roach, who still has a year left of eligibility, and he was still on the roster. Well, the next day, he enters the transfer portal, and the 4-year senior from Duke, again, Joe, is going to have a lot of suitors.
Sean, I can't think of one team in the country that would not or should not want Jeremy Roach. Talk about a guy who's been through it. Averaged 32 minutes a game, really, for the last 3 seasons. And his production's only gone up, Sean. Went from 8.6, 13.6 to 14. And I think he was a really important player for Duke down the stretch. I do think, you could pick apart some of his games. I know he didn't play the best against NC State, but I really think he guided them in the win against Houston. Sean, you're hearing the typical names like this: Arkansas, St. John's. I do believe Kentucky has also reached out to him. I don't have a good read on this one, to be quite honest with you. He did declare for the NBA draft too. That is a thing a lot of people have done. Look at Chanel Davis doing the same thing, who's also a guard, but this is still early on, and I bet you, Sean, this one is going to last a long time.
Yeah, Nova was close to him out of high school. You can go back to his Final Four to high school. Well, that was a while ago. And a lot of, Jay Wright was the lead recruiter. So Villanova fans need to not automatically pencil Jeremy Roach into your team next year just because he was in your last 3 when Jay Wright was a coach a couple years ago. But I think Houston's a name to look out for here. I think every talented team, you put him in point guard and get talent around him, I think you got a championship team. You got a championship point guard and a championship team. This is sort of the, why Jeremy Roach transferred. You have a lot of highly ranked freshmen coming in for Duke. This is a COVID year, so this is like basically an extra scholarship, but you're still going to have to give him minutes. So maybe there was a sort of thing from John Shire saying, like, Jeremy, I know that you've got an extra year, but we've got a lot of people coming in, and, we don't want to redshirt any of them. So I think we've seen this a couple places, like with Mason Gillis at Purdue and a couple of other grad transfers who have fulfilled their 4 years to their school, and they're playing somewhere else because they can. And, the freshman class has been oversigned. So, that could be a reason why he left. But, Joe, he is probably the best point guard in the transfer portal, at least left for sure, and maybe to have entered in the first place this year. And this will be a real interesting one to watch because, there's no list. Like, Mahinmi is, there's the 2 leaders for Mahinmi. There's no lead, really, on Roach so far. So that'll be something to look out for. We got one commitment that I want to ask you about, and then I think that'll be it for today because it's just nearing 25 minutes. Last commitment, Joe, fairly recently, maybe earlier today, late yesterday. We got Malik Mack going from Harvard to Ed Cooley's Georgetown. Mack was an awesome freshman this year in the Ivy League. Battled some injuries and mono, I think, and still put up numbers. He's a little bit undersized, but you have to think he's a pretty good fit for Georgetown with his ability to score the ball, coming from a highly ranked academic institution in Harvard. Good sign for Georgetown.
Yeah, it's funny because they're also looking at another undersized guard from a nice academic institution in Doug McDaniel, but the grades haven't really been there. If you watch Doug McDaniel's commitment video to Kansas State, you will know exactly what I mean. Was never good at school. But no, Sean, I think this is a solid signing for Cooley. I do think this is a bridge guy. A guy, he will play this year, but he'll also be there another 2 years, likely. I don't think he has much NBA prospects or will in the next year or two. So I think this is probably one of the bigger acquisitions Cooley's gotten. This certainly doesn't take them over the top or even from the bottom of the Big East, but I do think it is a start. I think he's someone who he wants to ride out and hopefully be a program guy, a lot of guys at Providence who fit that mold too could score a lot. So I like the pickup, but Georgetown, like many other teams in this portal, Sean, still a long way to go. And I do think this is only the first inning for Ed Cooley at Georgetown. So certainly a lot more to come there, I would assume.
Yeah, the backcourt of Epps and Mack is going to be pretty fun to watch. Now, Jaden
Yeah.
Epps kind of had to do it all himself last year, and we had some exceptional individual games, but you pair those two together, and I think Styles is transferring, so they have an open at the 3. You get a good wing in there. You still have Supreme at the 5. Like, I think there's a way that Georgetown could at least break into the middle of the pack of the Big East this year, but still um, plenty of scholarships to be filled. I think at this point, if you have more than half of your scholarships filled next year, you're probably ahead of the game because there's some schools with none, some other schools with more, and some question marks around NBA draft and all that. If somebody's entering the NBA draft while maintaining their college eligibility, 9 out of 10 times that means they're coming back. You have seen a couple just straight up sign with an agent like Khalil Ware, like Ugana Enyenso from Kentucky, which is a little bit of an odd one, especially because he was, sort of invisible for most of their games. But that deadline is not until May, so we won't know for sure about those players. But Joe, that's all we have from today. Obviously, we're recording this live on the night of April 17th, so transfer portal news can come pretty quick. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.